Almost every time I make a video referencing the Great Pyramid at Giza, I end up saying, I will talk about that a little more in a future video. And almost every time I do that, I end up with one or two or three of you saying, hey man, that's pretty sweet, but could we hurry the F along and get to that future video? So I figured I would go ahead and give it to you now. So without further ado, here is my response to Dr. David Miano's doctoral thesis, trying to elicit an emotional reaction from Graham Hancock using OnlyFans and a hairy male posterior. Hello and welcome back to DeDunking. And yes, in this episode we're going to be talking about Dr. David Miano's the Great Pyramid at Giza. Sorry about that. You can email him and ask him about his butt if you'd like. Actually, don't do that. I'm joking, and I've got a much smaller subscriber count than him, but nobody needs to be getting emails about people asking them to show their butt, unless they actually do have an OnlyFans. Anyway, let's talk about the Great Pyramid before we get way out into the bulrushes here. All right, so about 480 feet tall, 756 feet per side, supposedly built by Khufu like 4,500 years ago. Great Pyramid of Giza is like really well aligned, really accurate, really straight, big ass blocks, 2 tons to 22 ton stones, something like that. Some filling and facing blocks and stuff too. And it's supposedly squared through this weird method where they built out from the inside around the center block, because they did this weird thing with the pyramids. They put this big block in the center, this Primevil Mound, to represent the Ben stone, or the first Primevil Mound, the first rock of dirt that came through the floodwaters, right? So when they would level the dirt for a pyramid, they would put this big block in the middle. It's kind of problematic for a builder, because the general way that you square a building is you measure out the perimeter, and then you measure across the diagonals. And if all those measurements are the same, shit's square. If you measure it out and something ain't the same, well, then you got a problem. So when you can't measure the diagonal because there's a thing that's like the size, like 12 feet tall or so, 10, 15 feet tall, something like that, it's in the middle of the damn structure, you can't really run your rope or tape measure or whatever the hell they ran through it, ninja laser that they flew an airplane through, or they measured it. They couldn't do that with that block in the middle. That's kind of worth noting, because it has always been a problematic thing. There's some post holes supposedly on the side, and anyway, there's a lot of things going into how that they squared it and how they aligned it. So why am I talking about it? Well, personally, I don't believe that it was used for a tomb, and if it was used for a tomb, that was absolutely secondary, not the primary purpose of this pyramid, in my opinion. First reason that I have for that is the lack of inscriptions inside the thing. The only inscription that I'm aware of is the cartouche of Khufu that's way up in the top, like in the rough-in area of construction. Like if you've ever been in a basement that doesn't have sheetrock up, imagine the very top of a 2x4 having the builder's name written on it. It's kind of like that. It's weird, doesn't make a lot of sense. A lot of pyramid idiots like myself think it's a hoax, think that the guy who was doing the research at the time was like feet to the fire, had to make a find, so he was just like, oh yeah, look at this cartouche I found. But for my hypothesis on the pyramid, it really doesn't matter one way or the other if it's real or not. Security was crap in the thing. I mean, overall, and yes, you can compare it to other pyramids, but the fact of the matter is the thing is effing massive compared to other pyramids, most other pyramids. If the point of the thing is to like secure the pharaoh's body from all robbers and all evilness that could possibly happen to it, you would think that the bigger they would build it, the better the security would get, at least to some degree. But we really don't see that. Like, and like the mud brick ones are shit for the security, but by and large, they use kind of similar crappy security systems in most of them. Even the ones that have way more engineering and effort put into it, like the Great Pyramid of Giza. So that's another thing that makes me think it's more of a symbolic thing than it is an actual functional thing. The accuracy of this pyramid is exceptionally noteworthy. It is not only really well aligned to the cardinal points, it's really well aligned to itself. And as I mentioned already, there's that big old rock in the center of it coming right out of the bedrock. And that's really problematic for squaring that thing, especially in a day with no lasers or any of the other fancy tools we have now. They're using a rope. And I know, of course, you might say, well, still, we have a pyramid here, so it must be a tomb. Like, Sneferefru, however the hell you pronounce these guys' names. As you can tell, I've read these names a lot more than I've ever said them in real life. When you work construction, you don't go talking about Egyptian pharaohs without getting wedgies. That's just how that works. But at any rate, Sneferu, that Pokemon, he had 3 pyramids built. And two of them had sarcophagi right inside the damn thing, apparently, and one of them had like this burial center like right next to it. It looked like 3 times dude was going to get buried, and we all know, we don't know, but hey, we could probably assume he wasn't triplets. So it looks to me like he may have built some symbolic pyramids. Now, one of them was a generational project, and we will get to that in this video, not in a different video, guys. In this video, I promise. Dr. David Miano's butt we will not be talking about. So in my opinion, the 3 pyramids of Giza and many other pyramids throughout Egypt were actually part of a multi-generational building project for religious significance, spiritual significance, and I do believe that that was passed down a lot further back in time than the mainstream academia will give it credit for. That's normal academia. Anyway, out the gate it gets rid of this crazy 2 to 5 minutes per block, which is just absurd. Secondarily, we also have this happening already. We have like Sneferu. Anyway, he supposedly built a pyramid, like finished off one of his 3 pyramids, was one of the pyramids from the dude before. And I posit that is probably when he did the red pyramid is one of them, and that's a pretty good one, pretty big boy and pretty square and all that shit. I personally believe it was part of this original project. And that would explain why we have like Shepsikoff, or whoever his name is too. After the 3 big boys at Giza were finished, the next one is a mastaba. The next, place the dude's buried is a mastaba. Now he died after like 7 or 8 years, so maybe it was he didn't finish any sort of pyramid, but you would think that Sneferu had like 3 of them laying around. They could probably stuff him into one, right? But instead they put him in a mastaba, and maybe he was supposed to continue a building project and didn't, and pissed off the priesthood. One of the things that archaeologists and Egyptologists will posit is that maybe there was a war between the pharaoh and the royal family and the priesthood going on, and that this was one aspect of it. Well, it's quite possible to me that that is a building project that maybe all it took would be one person to drop the ball on, and he would be destroying the dynasty, right? It's quite possible. In my mind anyway, but who... Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I believe the Sphinx is much older than they also give it credit for, more in line with the Hancock Robert Schoch version of about 10,500 BC. And my personal reasoning has very little to do with the geology, although that does support it. The fact that it faces due east and was carved into a lion screams Leo. And the only time on the spring equinox, and any time recent, unless you want to go back to 30,000 BC, I don't even Graham Hancock would be hard pressed to go back that far. So to me, it just screams. And this is to me where archaeoastronomy and archaeology getting a pissing match. It's there's a lot of times where you can be like the Sirius Temple correlation on Malta, right? The lady on Dijik, I think her last name was, on Ancient Apocalypse, and she's like, oh, we have this correlation between Sirius and these temples on Malta. And mainstream academia is actually it's Crux, it's the Southern Cross, that's what we have a correlation with, and the dating is massively different. Not only do the dates of carbon dating and stuff support the idea of Crux, but just thinking supports the idea of Crux. People on an island would be using that first. But in Giza, you got a different problem altogether. This is a freaking equinoctial marker. It faces due east. It stares at Leo as the sun rises into it on the spring equinox, 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago. That was just a natural outcrop of rock, and it was carved to look like that lion. Like I said in my little short there, there's a good chance that that's where that Ben stone came from. In my mind, there's a good chance that this was that Primevil Mound, that this outcrop of rock that was as above, so below, touching sky to ground. In their minds, the ancient peoples, this may well have been the first place of the first time, which was very important to the Egyptians, for those of you who know anything about their mythology. So this area became a place associated with the Egyptian idea of creation or rebirth. There's a flood and something comes out of it. It's death and life renewal. Typical old school sympathetic magic like I was talking about. So why did the Giza Plateau become this entire necropolis? Why is it just a place for tombstones if, in my mind, it's something different than that? Well, in my opinion, it's heavily attached to the Sphinx being that place of the first time, being that Primevil Mound. I believe that them seeing that touching sky to ground, seeing this rock coming out that they could claim was the first chunk of earth to stick out of the flood. This was the world navel. This was the Omphalos, or however the hell it's pronounced. Many, many cultures throughout the world had this idea. Basically, it's the center of the world and everything grew out from there. So the belief that that was there made this a place that was naturally associated with resurrection. That's not really disputed as far as that the pyramids were a thing of resurrection. But in my opinion, this whole chunk of ground was associated with that because of the Sphinx. Its connection with the sky and it growing out of the ground through the flood, like I said. Through that sympathetic magic, which is, like I said, basically the idea that whatever magical power something has is basically what's written right on the tin. So, you know, if you want to run faster, catch some animal that's really quick and eat it while it's still alive or some bullshit. That kind of thinking, right, would say that you need to be remembered to be alive. And what better way to be remembered when you know your culture will eventually die off? The smart people will eventually have to recognize that Egypt can't live forever as this dynasty. They're going to see it. They're going to know it. So when they realize that, how do they make people think of them forever? How do we stay on the tips of people's tongues? How do we stay immortal? And I believe that's what those pyramids were for. Not just those three, but many other ones throughout, not many, but a few others throughout Egypt, were built with the intention of making a puzzle, making people think, making people wonder, making people ask questions. And by doing so, by making me do what I'm doing right now and you doing what you're doing right now, us all being titillated by this, Dr. Miyano's butt, here we go. It's like we are feeding into that whole thing. Now, that's convenient for me, but I'm trying to think of a way that makes sense with this without going down the crazy woo path. And I'm sorry, I don't see these as being tombs. I just don't. It doesn't make sense to my mind. This would also explain the multiple hits to archaeoastronomy for different dates, because every date would want to have their time put on there so that people would think about their generation or their era as well. So multiple dates would be encoded into the thing, as well as multiple people's names if they could do it. But we don't see any names in there, which again is one of my things that's kind of like, what the hell's going on here? But we do have the one cartouche of Khufu, and like I said, it really doesn't matter to my hypothesis, because think about it. If the whole goal of this thing is to make people think, and by extension making you immortal by them thinking about that generation, well, how powerful would it to be to hijack all that and stamp your name on the entire idea of immortality? Which I also think is what's happened with the Sphinx with the recarving of the face. It's like, hey, you know what? This is actually me. And all it would take would be one really powerful ruler, but it would also potentially destroy a dynasty or destroy a generation, or definitely create a war between the priesthood and the pharaohs, right? So I think that this could actually explain a lot of the internal strife that we see. This would be a very simple place that they would fight back and forth. It's like, this Sphinx is for all of the Egyptian pharaohs, and fuck you, it's my face on it. Well, okay, well, fuck you, now we're fighting back and forth. Again, this is just a belief. A lot of this stuff, we really don't know at all. I'm just looking at the situation and making my own assumptions based on the data that I'm aware of and that have at hand. And call me Dan Hancock if you want, whatever. Okay, we see a lot of the similar underworld type of mapping carved out into the pyramid floor plans all across Egypt. I do believe that that's a religious thing. I think that the archaeologists would agree with me on that. But let me ask you a quick question. If I was to say to you, what secret society that you're aware that actually exists is considered to hold all the secrets, or to consider to hold some secrets, I think we would all come to the same answer, pretty much, of like Freemasons. I mean, maybe some people would say something different, but Freemasons, I think. And if you look at their symbolism, and then you just look at the name, they're stone builders, man. So even today, we have this idea in our heads that stone builders have this mystical knowledge, magical something or other. They're hidden secrets. Now, the idea is really detached now from where it came from, in my opinion. But in my opinion, these guys' ability to work with stone and ability to do things that most other people couldn't figure out, and some other knowledge that, in my opinion, came along with it all. Graham Hancockian, Lost Civilization, has this packet of knowledge, which was not way advanced. God, I always have to point this out. I'm talking Bronze Age at the very best, all right? At the very best, we're talking Bronze Age. Anyway, so we have the whole as above, so below. We have the whole like sacred geometry thing. And we have modern day Freemasons. That's thousands of years ago. And we have the modern day with still the idea of, oh, they got some hidden secrets, some people would think. So, and in my opinion, that's all one package. That was inherited a long time ago. And I believe that that's like part of the thinking that built the pyramids. Okay, so to quickly summarize before I get to the last part, basically the pyramids were memory machines or thinking machines. The point was to make people think about this dynasty, this group of people, this time period, in order to facilitate them being immortal. That's my opinion, and that's why I think that they did so much goofy shit in the pyramids with all the secrets and the astronomical alignments and weird math and all the things you could argue about until the day goes long. So here's a part of the video that I personally am going to find the most enjoyable. And you may think that back in the 90s I spent too much time at those Lollapalooza type places and too little times like not smoking the herbs. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about how I think they actually squared the thing. And I don't mean aligned it. I'm not talking about its alignment to true north. That's pretty much understandable how they would get that using astronomy. The problem is they got this big ass rock in the center, and you already are hard pressed to get that kind of alignment without that rock in the center and your ability to measure across the corners. Like I mentioned before, a standard operating procedure for squaring a square building is you measure all the four sides in the perimeter and you measure across the diagonals. If all these measurements are the same, you're golden. If not, you need to look at it a little closer and figure some shit out. There's geometry you can do for the angles, but this really is geometry and not very helpful for building. And every time I see this in a paper, I just want to laugh because it's like this isn't how you do stuff. The problem that you have here, not only is the mound in the center doesn't allow you to measure across the diagonals, which even Mark Lehner figured out, but there's other issues that you have as well. This is a really long way. 756 feet is going to give you rope sag. Okay, you couldn't measure that with a tape measure. People use transits and laser levels for this shit nowadays for a reason. They measure it out with light because light doesn't vary, and so they bam, 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 and they get perfect. Even still, we're hard pressed to match the precision of the pyramids, and we don't use 20-ton stones. So for a guy who has worked construction, all of the dismissal of that from the academics is totally missing the point of the mystery, in my opinion. To do what they did here would be really fucking hard. There's no two ways about it. It would be really hard. And I don't just mean stacking rocks on top of each other because they're really heavy. That perfect square with big ass rocks is not easy to do. Perfect square with wood is not easy to do at 756 feet per side. Put something in the center where you can't measure the diagonals, you're talking a fucking serious problem. Well, that's all fine and good, you old ass hippie, but you are actually going to explain to us how this was done, I hear you all saying. And yes, it was really difficult for me to think about it, and I'm by no means saying this is how it was done. This is just the way that makes the most sense to my mind. This definitely would need experimentation that I do not have the time nor the resources to do. Hell, it was hard for me to even get the chance to babble at my freaking camera, all right? Life is busy right now. Lehner is talking about they have these post holes that are all marked around the pyramid's perimeter. So the idea basically is they measured around the square of that center and they expounded on that square and they just kept doing that until they filled the perimeter. I find that to be so ridiculously hard. Yes, on paper that's not that difficult, but in real life, man, oh man, is that going to be fucking hard to do. So okay, I'll explain real quick. The ropes don't just sag. They also get tight and sag. So the idea is you're going to wrap it around these posts and use those as a way to keep the rope from sagging. And that's great for an hour, but then the rope starts sagging because it got pulled tight. And a rope is very vulnerable to wetness, to freaking heat, to stretching, it's not a good measuring device. We use tape measures for a reason. It would be really easy to just tie a knot in a rope and stretch it across, and much cheaper, right? But we use tape measures because the tape measure is actually accurate and doesn't change length because it's metal. And so here's what I'm getting at here. You need something that is like modern day quality in order to get that kind of alignment. Just a quick comparison before I go down the road any further. The Greenwich Observatory in England is built to be north, south, east, west, cardinal point perfect. It was built 4,000 years after the pyramid at Giza. It did not use anything that weighed 20 tons, and it still is not nearly as accurate. And that's a problem. You can dismiss this and say they tried really hard. But as a guy who's worked with that shit, you don't just try really hard. It's like trying to carbon date something by trying really hard. Well, I give you 5,000 people and try really hard. You got no tools. You can't fucking do it. That's just how it is. So I was trying to figure out what tool they actually used, right? And so it actually came to me when I was having a discussion with the guy on Twitter a couple months ago, but I've been fleshing it out, trying to put it all together, and the reality of it is it just needs experimented with. I think that they used concave mirrors. If you take a concave mirror like we know the Greeks had, and the Egyptians had bronze mirrors, so they could have made a concave mirror, especially if you consider those fancy dishes that Uncharted X has a big heart on for. Those basically, in my opinion, are like a basis for like a offshoot of that technology. It's like a representation of this concave mirror put into this perfectly symmetrical, very well balanced dish. And the reason that I think they use this is because a concave mirror will always throw the same size circle at the same distance. And when it comes to a pinpoint, it's the pinpoint. So you could make a target out of stone, like one of those dishes I was just talking about, that had concentric circles, right? And then the concave mirror shoots at the thing with its beam of light, and if it fits this circle, it's this far away. If it fits that circle, it's this many cubits away. Do you follow what I'm saying? So as long as they leveled these things, and so they're not shooting up or down or anything, as long as they're making a straight shot across there because it's level, they could make a measurement that would never change. It wouldn't sag, it wouldn't stretch, and they could check it every day. They could literally go out there every single morning and check it. The only thing would be is that you would have to have a fairly large mirror. It wouldn't be gigantic, but it would be pretty big. Now those post holes that Lehner talked about that he claims were used to tie the ropes back and forth, these could have been calibration points, because you would absolutely have to have this very stable and very level. There is a ditch that's been scratched around the entire perimeter of the Great Pyramid, and it's more pronounced at the ends, the corners, and that was presumably used to level things, and I would agree. So you could level it with this ditch. There's holes down at each end as well. There's holes that are like 16 inches in the ground, more like 12 inches into the ground, but they could raise the rocks above that center mass and shoot straight across that diagonal and still get that diagonal measurement. And not only get the diagonal measurement, but get a 756 foot diagonal measurement perfect. That would explain how shit ended up so accurately there, because they're going to drop rocks and miss things by a tiny bit. You put down a 20-ton stone and it's 99.99% perfect, you're going to leave that fucking thing where it landed. But to get it 99.99% perfect, you're going to have these guy lines that are perfect. And in my opinion, this is a good candidate. I'm not saying for sure that this is how I did it by any means, and no, I'm not trying to be all slimy with it. I'm just saying that it needs experimentation, man. This is something that actually needs played with, but the light will always be the same distance, and if you make that perfect symmetrical mirror, that again, I think those dishes were like a representation of it, a copy of that same technology, that same idea, but built into a plate instead of a mirror. And then on a side note, could you imagine the followers of Horus, the worshippers of the sun, grabbing the power of the sun and not just shooting it around being like, hey, check out, I can redirect the sun's rays, but utilizing it, actually putting it to work? Oh man, I think that explains all those pictures that we see of the dudes with the big old fucking hard-ons. They're playing with the freaking sun, man. Okay, well, I hope that didn't disappoint any of you. Thank you very much for watching. I'm always nervous about stuff like this because I'm, you know, the pyramid world is like full of all these crazy hypotheses, and so many of them are so sciencey, but they're all like, in my opinion, most of the ones on our side of the fence are just, they're a little bit too woo oriented. They're just a little bit too out there. So I hope this isn't too mundane. I hope this isn't too woo with the freaking mirror. Thanks a lot for requesting this, letting me get a chance to just like talk about this without having to cry about Dr. David Miato's buttocks or somebody else's buttocks. Whose buttocks should I talk about in my next video? That's a pretty good question. Whose ass should we expose next? See it on OnlyDans. No, seriously, thanks a lot for watching. I can't say it enough. I love you guys, man. Watching my channel grow just tells me that I'm able to talk about things like this and that it actually does have an audience. Fucking crazy. You guys have a great evening, and we will talk again soon.
You look amazing tonight. Thanks for swiping right.
Really stupid idea.